What's good, YouTube? Welcome back to my channel. Before we get started, I would love it if you could hit the subscribe button so that we could spread the good word about design education. I am still very much on a mission to educate as many people about graphic design as I possibly can, and I would love your help in that venture. If you enjoy what you learned here today, make sure to share this video along with subscribing. But before we jump into today's lesson, I do want us to start with a math question. And I know that it's not the most exciting thing in the world, but I promise you it's going to help your understanding even more. And it might be a little complicated, so you might want to pull a sketchbook out so you can do some work. Yes, you did come to a design education video, so you got to do a little note taking. All right, if you're ready, here's the math problem. What is 1 plus 1? I'm being dead serious. What is 1 plus 1? And it's not what you think. Huh? I'm gonna give you a second though. I'm gonna really let you think about this.
A few moments later.
All right, your second's up. It's time to move on. If you said 2, you're wrong. I'm sorry. You're wrong. You're wrong. Argue with your mama. In this scenario, 1 plus 1 actually equals 3. And this concept comes to us from Gestalt psychology, which states that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. In this specific example, we see two lines come together in close enough proximity where they start to create a third line out of negative space. And that's actually really key to what we're going to talk about today, because typography is nothing more than the complex relationship between positive and negative space. And I'm almost certain that typographers out there would disagree with that, but I'm trying to teach the children. Fight me later. I think that this is the best way to understand typography on a fundamental level though. So let's break it down for a second. Positive space refers to the subject matter of a design. Negative space is the white or empty space in and around a design's subject. The black letter forms and shapes on my shirt, for example, are all positive space. The white space in and around these shapes are all negative space, even the ones that start to create letter forms. I didn't necessarily do this intentionally, but the shirt definitely shows the complex nature of understanding typography and its relationship to positive and negative space. Let's break it down very simply for a second. So we are going to get into the territory of glyphs versus characters. Characters refer to individual instances of letters, numerals, symbols, punctuations, and other things found in the typeface. A glyph refers to the specific shape or design of those characters. So you can have different glyphs of the same character. But as they say, that's only the tip of the iceberg. We're going to go over 3 of the most decorated understandings of positive and negative space relationships when it comes to typography. We're going to start from what I consider to be the relatively easiest to understand down to the hardest to understand. But before we do that, I have to change into my lecture glasses. That's better. So because my bona fides lies in design education, I am very prone to giving lectures and presentations, but I promise you, you will not be bored. And I promise that it'll be a quick presentation. This really isn't a super complex review. And I'm sure I'm going to miss a few things, but in terms of understanding basic information, this is the place, shawty. This is the place, shawty. You really want to be here. You want to be here right now. You want to learn the things with us. So like I said, we're going to explore the relationship between positive and negative space through 3 different, pretty decorated avenues in typography. First up is leading. So leading is the vertical space between lines of text, and back when typesetting was done with letterpress, the space between the lines of text was achieved by laying strips of thin lead between each line, hence the name. And you've probably encountered leading when writing papers in middle school or high school. I'm sure you've heard it dozens and dozens and dozens of times. 12-point font, Times New Roman, double space. And you were probably told that this format is a little bit easier to read, and that sentiment holds true. The more negative space you allow between lines of text, the more legible that text becomes. Typefaces are measured in points, and so too is leading. For example, if you're using Times New Roman at 12 points, what most people call double spacing is actually 24 points, double the size of the actual typeface. But unless you're always working in the MLA format, double spacing won't always work in design. Typically, when you're setting body copy, depending on the typeface and the medium, you want your leading to fall between 120% and 150% the point size of your type. Staying within that range keeps the text relatively balanced, and it keeps it from looking way too cramped or way too loose. The good news is that most design softwares will do the math for you. Just enter the point size into the leading menu, add an asterisk to multiply, type in a value between 1.2 and 1.5. For instance, if you're working with 12-point type and multiply it by 1.25, the software will automatically give you the leading that is ideal for this size. Now keep in mind, leading is primarily about legibility. That's why things really take a turn once you start working with display sizes like headers or titles. As the type gets larger, leading should actually shrink, starting primarily at 100% and gradually reducing as the type size increases. For example, with a typeface that is sized at about 145 points, the leading should be around 145 points or less, depending on the typeface itself. A similar principle comes up when working with lowercase i's or j's. In most typefaces, the tittle, which is the dot above both of these letters, is set relatively high by default for clarity at small sizes, but as the letters get larger, that space really becomes unnecessary. The bigger the letter form, the less distance you'll need between the body of the letter form and the tittle. I would recommend dropping the tittle down about 2/3 of its current height to achieve a more balanced look at larger sizes. But, you might want to lean on your local typographer about what is the ideal distance to drop your tittle. That's just my recommendation. I do have one other caveat though. Only adjust the tittles once your text is finalized. Refining details like dropping the tittle requires outlining the text, and you don't want to deal with the headache of editing outline text if the copy needs to change later. That is a pain that you do not want to suffer. All right, so now we're going to move on to the next thing, which is tracking. The thing that I want to emphasize here is that tracking is the simultaneous horizontal spacing between characters across a line of text. Tracking directly affects legibility, similar to leading. When you're dealing with a block of text in all caps, for example, introducing tracking can make it much easier to read. Typically though, body copy is rarely set in all caps. That's only in special circumstances. So this advice mostly applies to those special instances. What you really want to pay attention to is the density of each of the glyphs. The thicker the glyph, the more negative space is needed between characters in the line of text. Likewise, if body copy gets smaller, the tracking should open up slightly to maintain legibility. Unlike leading, there is not a fixed mathematical formula for tracking. Designers typically adjust it based on the size and the weight of the typeface to make sure that text stays easy to read. And it's less about strict numbers and more about making sure the spacing allows for that comfortable reading experience. Getting too loose with tracking looks absurd. Getting too tight with your tracking can really cause a lot of legibility issues. You have to find that medium spot. Now, last but not least, I want to move on to kerning, which is a pretty difficult concept for beginning designers to understand. Unlike tracking, kerning deals with the space between individual characters in a line of text. And this may seem like a subtle distinction, but there is actually a functional difference between tracking and kerning. Tracking affects legibility across a line of text. You're worried about aesthetics here to a very minimal degree. Kerning deals with the aesthetics and balance of letter forms and words, period. The goal of kerning is to focus on visual harmony between letter forms. While legibility is important, that's not the goal of kerning. And this is where understanding Gestalt psychology becomes really important. With kerning, you're no longer just observing the text as a whole. You need to consider the individual parts of each letter form and how they interact with one another. To simplify, I'm going to strip these letter forms of all of their meaning and look strictly at their shapes. Now, most typefaces contain 4 basic shapes here: squares, rectangles, which I've kind of grouped together here, circles, and triangles. Now, the optical balance between 2 letter forms that are of the same shape language is relatively easy. For example, 2 rectangles side by side or 2 circles side by side, it's really easy to understand what their spatial relationship should be. You can tell when there is too much space, too little space, or just enough space because the negative space around it is even and uninterrupted by any dynamic parts. The tricky part comes in when different shapes like triangles and circles are next to each other. By default, many kerning combinations between triangular and circular shapes make this really unusually large space between the letter forms, which can make the typography feel inherently unbalanced. To correct this, you need to bring the letter forms closer together. The best way to approach this is by eyeballing the spacing between similar letter forms, then mentally turning that space at an angle to judge how far apart each of these letters should be. For example, I want to take the word love. By default, the letters are kind of spaced out pretty grossly, and you can see the extreme distance between the triangular shape of the V and the circular shapes of the O and the E. Adjusting the spacing makes the word feel a lot more balanced and thoughtful. And again, you want to observe how the negative space interacts between those similar shapes and apply that similar spacing concept at an angle between the triangular shapes and the circular shapes. So obviously there are going to be exceptions to these rules. Obviously, there are going to be exceptions to these rules. You're not going to necessarily have to kern every poorly balanced letter form combination in a body of text. That would be absurd and it's time consuming, and there are better ways to handle that. You only want to kern when you're dealing with display type or logo type. Similarly, you don't want to make your leading so tight that it is completely illegible. Even if you are working at large point sizes, you don't want to overdo it. So proceed with caution, proceed with common sense, and make good choices. And if you like what you've learned here today and you want to continue to learn design fundamentals, please subscribe to this channel, and I will see you the next time I upload something, which, as long as this has taken the edit and film, it'll probably be another 3 months from now. I doubt that, but I appreciate the support. Again, like and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Peace.